A dear friend of the podcast, V.I. Lennon, actually wrote about Australia and New Zealand back in the day. He was fascinated by Australia and New Zealand because he saw them as working men's paradise. And I'm saying men because actually women didn't benefit from a lot of those benefits to begin with. But he was interested in accumulating economic statistics. And we found those statistics somewhere. And essentially, in the early 20th century, average meat consumption in Australia, according to V.I. Lenin, was 239 pounds per person. In France, at the same time, it was 77 pounds per person. Even in the United States, it was 150 pounds per person. So the standard of living in Australia was second to none.
The end of history is over, the period in which it was believed that liberal democracy was the final form of human government is no more. In this turbulent age, you need a podcast to explore the contours of the end of history. Welcome to BungaCast. My name is Alex Hochuli in São Paulo, Brazil, and this podcast is also Philip Cunliffe and George Hoare in the UK. In this episode, George talks to Shahar Hameiri and Tom Chodor about a part of the world that seems to have escaped this new turbulence. Economic growth, high wages, steady if boring politics. Australia and New Zealand seem stuck back at the end of history. George asks them if this is true, and if so, why? The first part of this interview is available to everyone, but if you want to find out what Lenin really thought about Australia and New Zealand, what the Dominion mode of development is, what the chances are for Australia and New Zealand's populists, and how long these countries can keep the steady neoliberal show on the road for, you'll need to subscribe to this podcast at patreon.com/bungacast. Also in part 2 is the after party in which George, Phil and I discuss whether Australia and New Zealand's political systems are actually able to absorb and respond to people's frustrations, especially as China's slowdown comes to impact these countries' economies. So once again, as soon as you're done listening to this episode, head over to patreon.com/bungacast for the second part.
Yes, I'm delighted to be joined today by Shahar Hameiri, who's Professor of International Politics at the University of Queensland, and Tom Chodor, who's a Senior Lecturer in Politics and International Relations at Monash University. And so Shahar normally works on policy, security and development in Asia, and Tom on political economy and global governance. But together, they're going to be co-authoring a book on Australia's response to COVID, which is out later this year. But today, we wanted to talk particularly about Australia, New Zealand, and the end of history, or as some people like to frame it, the end of history. So this was something that we came up with together, the three of us, to talk about the way we were going to frame it. But yeah, so why were you interested in discussing this topic?
Yeah, thanks, George, and thanks for having us on the pod. So actually, the idea for this came from listening to the podcast and actually from reading your book, because Tom and I, we talk quite a lot. Many people say too much, but we talk a lot with each other. And when we do, we're sort of political tragics, both of us, which I think is something that is probably relevant for a lot of people that listen to the podcast. And we do think and talk about a lot of these things on a regular basis. And listening to your podcast, it occurred to me that a lot of the stuff you talk about is not actually happening here. And from my understanding from talking to Tom, is not really happening that much in New Zealand as well. Now, given that almost all of the elements that you guys talk about in relation to what's happening in other liberal democracies in Europe and North America, or mainly the United States and North America, are quite similar to things that have happened here in the quote-unquote Antipodes, I think it begs the question, right? But we didn't actually have a chance to write a paper yet. We're just trying to work through that question, I guess, on the podcast with you, and maybe the listeners will have something to say about that as well.
No, yeah, I guess we do need some Australian and New Zealand representation. We don't want to be excluding that part of the world from our end of history thesis. But I guess before we kind of get into that, the meat of that discussion, which it's great to hear that the podcast has stimulated discussions, even if ones which are like, this isn't happening over here, and we can get into that. So the political background, I think it's useful just to give some of our listeners who might not be as familiar with the quote unquote Antipodes, what it's like over there. So Australia, the lucky country, is this? Why do Australians have this self-conception?
Oh, okay. Well, you get into the big questions right from the get-go. Well, actually, the term "the lucky country" originally was said ironically by Donald Horne, who wrote the book, because he argued that Australia actually didn't deserve its luck. Especially its leaders and its industrialists were coasting on the luck of just being what it is, where it is, and the particular circumstances that it had. But it became far less ironic over time, right? I mean, it became something that Australians do use as some kind of a brand for the country. And look, I mean, we do get to surf a lot more than you guys in the UK, so maybe that's a good reason for it. But maybe something that we'll pick up on during this podcast is a little bit about the kind of political economy that we have here, which, compared to circumstances in many other parts of the world, is maybe more favorable to a lot of people. So to that extent, maybe that tagline actually does work. I don't know. What do you think, Tom?
Well, I think yes, and thank you, and thanks for having us, George. As you know, we are both of us long-time listeners, first-time callers, so very happy to be with you. And it's funny that you pick up on the lucky country phrase, because it is so often used here unironically. People don't actually realize that it was being used in a critical sense. But I think, as we'll be talking today, there is quite a specific trajectory for Australia and New Zealand to an extent, both in the 19th and 20th century, which sets it apart from many other parts of the West, so to speak, both in the way that it was settled and the way it developed throughout the 20th century, and in many ways got a lot of breaks, got a lot of lucky breaks when it came to developments elsewhere that ended up working in its favour. And Australia is definitely has got a sense of that. New Zealand always doesn't feel so very lucky, and obviously very resentful of the big brother across the ditch, but also has a very similar trajectory overall, even if at a sort of a smaller brother trajectory. So I think we'll be getting into that, because that's quite an interesting part of the story.
Yeah, so just to kind of like give listeners a bit of a starting point, like is it right to take Australia and New Zealand as the same? Is it is New Zealand also the lucky country? Is it the unlucky country? Not to preempt some of the, I guess, more detailed historical discussion, but I just have a feeling that some listeners might think New Zealand, Lord of the Rings has put it on the map.
Can't argue with that.
I'm just revealing my own ignorance and projecting it onto listeners, which is a neat trick to do. But yeah, I guess how would a New Zealander or a Kiwi kind of characterize their country? Unlucky country, moderately lucky, derivatively lucky, or in a different kind of way?
The phrase that we use in New Zealand is God's own, as in God's own country. Obviously, the best country in the world that no one knows about, because we're at the arse end of the world, far away from everyone, and happy to be there. So I think in that sense, there is a sort of a conception in New Zealand of being a very privileged and very lucky and very, very good place to live. Obviously, the Australians are the worst and we hate them. But at the same time, I think you'll be hard-pressed to find two countries that are more similar in the world culturally, culture-wise. The movement between the two countries is basically free. I'm a New Zealander who moved to Australia 16 years ago, and I haven't gone back.
Against a better judgment.
Despite Shahar's best efforts, so there's our sporting teams play at each other's sporting competitions. It's a very, very close relationship. It's always the first port of call for whichever prime minister gets elected to go to New Zealand or Australia, and vice versa. So I think there are certain differences in the culture, but overall they're very similar country. In New Zealand, sees itself as lucky, but perhaps not so confidently. That sort of cocky Australian annoying larrikinism that you see in London after midnight when the Australians get on the piss. New Zealanders are much more reserved. They'll be standing in the corner looking staunch and cool and trying to not to draw too much attention to themselves. Or at least that's how they like to perceive themselves. But overall, there is a perception of being a God's own country, a country really that has everything you wanted to have.
And if I can just come in on that, and I think that is relevant to the story that we were going to be maybe telling today. Both countries, and that definitely has something to do with their history, have a sense of relative egalitarianism as part of public culture, as part of how people engage with each other. That's something that probably stands out more than you would get in many other parts of the world. So, it's entirely normal for an Australian. I mean, to a great extent, a lot of that is a myth, by the way, but it's not like every myth. It's got some grounding in reality. So it's not unusual for an Australian to call their prime minister mate, or, just talk to someone like that very, very colloquially, without too many airs and, and so on. And I think that also has something to do with, the history of these countries. New Zealand is quite similar in that respect. So that is maybe an element of the culture that they do share, and that does differ somewhat from the countries you normally cover on the podcast.
Yeah, I think we definitely get into that kind of political culture and how that could have, what effect that might or might not have had on kind of events around potentially 2016 in other parts of the world, which presaged the end of history. But to kind of give, I guess, listeners a bit more political history and or account of the political systems maybe in Australia and New Zealand, how would you explain those to us a bit? I mean, how would you explain it to me? Also a Commonwealth. We're keeping it Commonwealth on this podcast to a certain extent, but the like a Brit who maybe has some knowledge of the culture as you've just described it, but probably doesn't know as much about the political system as they would like to.
Okay, so the Australian political system, to some extent, like the New Zealand political system, which I'll let Tom elaborate on a bit in a second, both of them derive from the Westminster system, right? So there is a House of Parliament, and Australia has two houses, which is somewhat like the British system, but it's sort of like a bit of a mix between the British and the American system, because the lower house, called the House of Representatives, it's made up of people that are elected in electorates around the country. Basically the Senate is a little bit like an American Senate in a sense that every state has the same number of representatives, and the territories have fewer representative senators, but they still come from the different states. But that's done more in a form of proportional representation at the state level. And that's why smaller parties can get in more easily at the Senate than in the lower house. But there are two things I think we need to highlight about that system which make it different from the British and maybe some other Westminster system, and that are relevant for our story, although I think more is made of them than there should be. And that's the issue of preferential voting and the issue of compulsory voting. So let's start with compulsory voting, something that PMC types like to talk about a lot in the Australian context, and to explain Australia's quote-unquote better electoral outcomes through that. And the idea is that you have to vote. You cannot not vote. You can come in and put a blank, just not actually vote, but it can spoil your vote, but you have to actually turn up. If you don't turn up, you get a fine. Okay, so that's quite different.
What's the fine? Is this?
It's a few $100s, so it's not an insubstantial fine. It's not a huge fine. I mean, people can probably manage, but it is a fine. Okay, and otherwise you have to provide some kind of an excuse why you didn't turn up, and that's very different because bringing out the vote is not a big issue in Australia. Okay.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is preferential voting, which is something that I'm not aware of. I don't think it exists in any other country, but basically what it is, you get the ballot paper and all the candidates for that seat are on it, and you have to rank them from, let's say there are 8, from 1 to 8. And if the candidate that you put in one is not in the top two, then your vote moves to the person that is in the top two at that point. So that means no vote gets wasted because they get shifted around. And that means that generally the bigger parties have a better chance of winning because generally there will be somewhere ranked up in most people's ballot paper. And that's very different from the first past the post system, which you have in the UK. And then there's federalism as well, which works sort of similarly, but I'm not going to get into that too much right now.
So it's a kind of Westminster plus some added complications in the voting system and compulsory voting.
That's right.
New Zealand. What's the vibe?
The vibe's not too dissimilar. And also, has the Westminster parliamentary sort of heritage that Australia does, and so the Dominions do. But it's three key differences from Australia, which I think we can get into later as well, and the sort of the importance that they have for outcomes. But firstly, there's a unicameral system, so there's only one House of Parliament. There's no Senate. There's no House of Lords. It's a very centralised system where there's a Parliament in Wellington. And that is, that basically governs everything. There's no sort of regional, there's no provincial governments or anything like that. The electoral system is different to Australia as well. It's called MMP, Mixed Member Proportional, which is basically similar, from what I understand, to the German system. It's meant to provide a much more representative parliament. It was introduced in 1996, was the first election that it ran in. And Shahar and I had joked that this was actually New Zealand's Brexit moment, where the population basically put two fingers up to the political class, because there'd been a series of governments elected through first past the post that were not representative at all of society, got low council votes, but got in most seats, and they passed some far-reaching reforms that were very unpopular. And at some point, this idea was floated of changing the electoral system, and there was a whole commission that came up with the system. Neither party wanted to do it. But through a couple of elections, they ended up sort of goading each other on to put the system through, which would solve all the problems of New Zealand, to make it more proportional, to make Parliament more proportional representative. And eventually, there was a referendum which all the political class campaigned against, and it won through two stages. Both stages were passed to move to the system because people were so pissed off with the political class. So essentially, when you vote in New Zealand, you get two votes. You get one vote for your local electorate, local MP, just like you would in Australia or most other parliamentary systems. Then you also get a party vote, a party list vote. And essentially, each party has a list of its MPs that are not standing for a seat, and they top up the number of seats that they get in Parliament. So the idea is that the number of seats they have in Parliament is proportionate to their national vote that they got overall. So that was introduced in 1996, and the idea there is that it's more representative. The idea there is very difficult to have a majority government. There's only been one majority government since it was introduced in 1996, and that's the current one. There was Jacinda Ardern one during the COVID pandemic. And it sort of made a coalition government much more common and much more frequent and much more normalized in New Zealand. And then the final thing is that there is no compulsory voting. So we're not sort of, in the business of telling people what to do like we are in Australia. But New Zealand was actually the first nation in the world to have truly universal suffrage, which is something that people probably don't know about. It gave all men the vote in 1879 and then all women the vote in 1893 before any other country in the world. So it has a long democratic tradition, doesn't feel the need to tell its people to go to the polls, unlike some of the people across the ditch.
So it's
here we go.
So it's more if you want to, you can do. No, I think that's interesting. I guess that kind of Westminster starting point and then departures. This is something we're gonna obviously dig into a little bit more. But I also wanted to, if that's the kind of the political system, and that obviously frames some of the political options in both cases. What about in really broad brush terms, like, do you have socialism? Do you have liberalism? Do you have conservatism on that kind of that model of those kind of?
George, who has socialism? Come on.
Traditions? Well, do you have people who use the term socialism more than anything else. No, I guess just like, are those political traditions the same as, developed on roughly European model of those being the three that competed the 20th century, and then the 21st century being more of a collapse of those? Or how's it work? Give us a super potted political history of these kind of traditions in both countries, please. Thank you.
Well, the first thing to say is that, yes, I mean, the traditions are fairly similar. And the political system, in terms of the parties that are present in that system, is very similar to the kind of thing you got mid-20th century in most liberal democracies in the West, right? So to that extent, it's quite similar. I think if there are some differences, firstly, conservatism in Australia originally, what it meant was more affinity with the British Empire and with Britishness. That's historically what it meant. That's not really the case anymore, and it has been the case for a long time. But the more contemporary strain of conservatism is more like neoconservatism, and that's, again, not all that different from the kinds of what is now known as conservatism in other countries, although far less virulent, than you would find, say, in the Republican Party today or something like that in the United States.
So what does this kind of contemporary Australian conservatism look like?
It combines essentially more socially conservative positions, but not as socially conservative as you find in the United States.
Right.
So I guess more like maybe what you would find in Britain, that would be considered socially conservative. So abortions, things like that, are not really a big deal. Religion, far less of a big deal. Right. But, there are certain ways in which, there's probably a bit more of a preference for more traditional forms of living, but not as pronounced as, for instance, the right in the United States, But that's basically the kind of the general gist of it, and economically quite liberal overall. Although, as in many parts of the world, maybe that's starting to shift a little bit, and we can talk about that. But historically, there's been a commitment to economic liberalism. So that's very similar to neoconservatives more generally. And also there is the element, which we're not going to probably talk about too much, which is the attachment to the alliance with the United States. So it has a manifestation in foreign policy as well. But that's something that probably we can't really get into. And I guess one other thing to say is that the Australian Labor Party is historically a very successful Labor Party, and you mentioned socialism, right? It is actually the world's first Labor government is in my state of Queensland. That happened in 1899, and then in 1904, Australia had the first national federal Labor government of any country, and that. To explain that, I think we need to get into a lot of the stuff that we'll probably talk about a bit more later. But the way that I see it is that party was never a particularly radical left-wing party. In fact, my view, looking at the history of the Labor Party, is that actually it is Australia's first properly nationalist party, if anything, right? Because this is in the context of, like I said, conservatism being seen as being more closely affiliated with the empire. And the Labor Party actually split during World War I, because the Prime Minister of the day, who was originally from the Labor Party, wanted to continue fighting the war, but the Labor movement didn't want to fight the war. So he split the party and created another party in order to continue to fight the war, because, Australia was perceived to be part of the British Empire. The British Empire is fighting, Australia should be there too. But the Labor movement and parts of the Labor Party did not agree with that. So that's why I'm saying that, to my mind, while the gains for workers were really quite remarkable compared to other parts of the world, I think that it was also more of a real nationalist party, something that then other parties took on as well.
I think if listeners want to hear an analysis of which has some echoes of that in Britain, then the episode with David Edgerton that we did previously, which we'll link to in the show notes, could be a good counterpoint. What about liberalism, though? Or Tom, you wanted to come in maybe on, is this the same in New Zealand, this kind of, conservatism moving from an attachment to the British Empire to a more kind of what we might expect now, kind comparing with other parts of the world, economically liberal, socially conservative, and the kind of Labour approach being more properly perhaps characterised as nationalist. Does that fit? Or
I think Tom,
Yeah,
being a liberal, would be very well placed to talk about liberalism as well.
absolutely. I think that's one point of difference as well between the two countries. And I have this pet theory, which admittedly has not been tested by extensive research, but maybe will be one day, that New Zealand is actually a much more liberal country than Australia is because it was settled by the Enlightenment Scots. Since settlement and it was quite a late, one of the last place to be settled by Europeans at the start of the 19th century. It was settled by Enlightenment Scots, and it always had a vision of itself as a very liberal, progressive society compared to Australia, which not completely, but to a large extent, was settled by Irish Catholics, and had that more. That I think that's where that social conservatism comes from, and still sort of permeates the political culture. Whereas I think, New Zealand is a very strong liberal tradition. The first sort of major reformist governments in the late 19th century or 20th centuries were liberal governments, and they passed things like universal franchise and began sort of the welfare state under a liberal sort of banner, and that's sort of continued throughout New Zealand's history, even as Labour emerged as a political force again in the early 20th century. It finally got elected in the 1930s during the sort of the depths of the Great Depression, and really turned into a sort of very much a mixed economy model during that time, similar to what the rest of the Western world was doing. But Labour, had almost 15 years of uninterrupted power over the 1930s and 1940s, and really changed the structure of the New Zealand economy, at least, which we'll get to shortly in a second, and really put the sort of the forces on the conservative side, on the right of the political spectrum, on the back foot. And when they finally got in after the war, after the 1940s, a lot of that sort of Labour's legacy remained for the next 40 years until the 1980s. And then there, the conservatism was similar to Australia's that Shahar described. It was more British than the British, but it was very much British. It wasn't English. It was very much British in the empire, but also sticking with a lot of the reforms that had been passed. So I think overall the story is similar. In terms of sort of the political spectrum between a right wing national party, as it's called, and sort of a social democratic Labour Party. But I think the tradition of liberalism makes the country a much more socially liberal place, especially now. But also, as we'll talk about shortly about the economic side, New Zealand really dove headfirst into neoliberalism from the 1980s onwards, perhaps more than any other country. I think partially because it had that long-standing liberal tradition.
Just before moving on to, I guess, how to situate the countries with relation to Anglosphere or Australasia, Shahar, just in terms of the liberal tradition in Australia, how's that developed? I guess we'll kind of come on to the transition to neoliberalism, but I just wanted to round out the picture a little bit, because I think it's useful just to have this background.
Sure. So actually, the most successful political party in Australia's history is the Liberal Party. The Liberal Party was formed after World War II by Prime Minister Robert Menzies, who actually was Prime Minister already in the 1930s, just at the start of the war. But that was in a different party. So he managed to bring together a number of those small sort of smaller centre-right parties and create a much larger party. He called it the Liberal Party. And he called it the Liberal Party for a reason, because he did actually see it as a liberal party, combining both what was at the time socially liberal attitudes. I mean, obviously, then maybe not quite as liberal as contemporary social attitude, but of the time, but also more economically liberal than the Labour Party. Now, they governed after the war, and they were, broadly speaking, Keynesian, their leanings, right? I mean, we're not talking here about the kind of liberalism or neoliberalism that we get later on, but they were definitely more liberal than the Labour Party, more committed to freeing up markets, to private sector development and so on. But they also did a fair bit of nation building in the post-war years, built universities and all sorts of things like that. And they also, broadly speaking, got most of the support from big business, and also from what they call in Australia the squattocracy, or the old money kind of landed gentry types. A lot of them supported that party. But that party began to change probably from around the 1990s, and it has moved further to the right on social issues. Like I said, economically, it also moved further to the right, but that happened to the Labor Party as well. But they became more neoconservative under the prime ministership of John Howard. And that's partly because he was going after people in the outer suburbs that became known as Howard's battlers. These were people that previously would have supported Labor, but he managed to recruit them in part by coming across more socially conservative than the people that became Labor's sort of main voices. But again, this is not as socially conservative as maybe what you get in the South in the United States or something like that, but, by relative terms. So that's where the party has gone, and it has moved further in that direction. But even up until very recently, they had a prime minister just a few years ago, Malcolm Turnbull, very socially liberal person. So these kinds of people remain in the party, and there may be a handful of them still now. But the party has overall moved further to the right on many of these issues. So a lot of those more liberal people now probably feel more at home either in the Labor Party or as independents, or maybe even in the Greens in some cases.
To bring it up to the present day, we were talking about this a bit before we recorded, the kind of like painting a picture of the different kind of supporters of contemporary parties or like movements within Australia and New Zealand. This isn't like a kind of marketing thing where you need to have a pen pick and you need to kind of have like a cool like market segmentation. But if you do want to do that off the top of your head, then do feel free. But yeah, I guess bringing it to the present day, what are the kind of who are the main parties or political actors? What are their who are their constituents, typical supporters? What do they look like? How's that kind of arranged in both cases?
Well, I think the thing that makes it kind of curious is actually that the picture I'm going to paint for you is going to sound remarkably similar, because it's actually very, very similar to what you get in many Western countries today. So the Labor Party, yep, it still gets support from organised labour, but organised labour is not as much of a force as it used to be. It still gets more support from the lower paid, the poor Australians than, say, the Liberal Party. But it also gets most of its support, or at least comes across as a relatively kind of PMC type party. The people that they have in Parliament, the people that lead the party, that's basically who they are. They're lawyers, they're human rights advocates. I mean, those kinds of people. Some people from the union movement, but even they are very professional union organizers that always had their eye on becoming politicians. There's very few people from the shop floor that rise up in the Labor Party, which I think is very similar to what you get in the UK. Then you get the Greens. The Greens UK, again. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, UK Labour Party led by a lawyer, indeed. So,
exactly. Yeah, and that's something that's very familiar. And then the Greens are a growing force in Australian politics. And again, this would sound very familiar if anyone actually read the book, At the End of History. You talk about the upwardly mobile and the downwardly mobile sections of the PMC. I think the Greens have a bit of both. The best example for this would be I reside in the electoral seat of Ryan, which is one of Australia's better off electoral seats, I must say. And our seat was recently taken by the Greens. Now that is a seat that Labor could never in a million years would have taken. It was always a Liberal Party seat, always on the centre right, until the last election, with the exception of 9 months in its entire history of several decades. Right. And it went to the Greens. Why? Because the Greens fielded someone, a professional, a former architect, or actually she was an architect at the time, and she appealed to those kinds of voters. But then the Greens also have the downwardly mobile supporters, who are often also of the PMC, educated, but they're more interested in things like redistribution and so on. They care more about that kind of stuff, housing policy, those kinds of things, because they don't do that well, usually materially. And then the Liberal Party basically today gets most of its support. It used to get a lot more of its support from the upwardly mobile middle classes. But these days, most of its support comes from non-PMC middle classes, and especially for small business owners. So he gets a lot of support from what we call tradies here. I don't know if you use the term in the UK. People who are have their businesses, like they're plumbers or electricians, and a lot of those kinds of petty bourgeois type pursuits. And it's also trying to appeal to the poorer people, which tend to live in Australia more in the outer suburbs of the major cities, because it perceives them as being more socially conservative than the inner city types, the kind of the real city people. So he tries to appeal to them. And then there's the National Party that they always govern in coalition with, and that's basically an entirely rurally based party. So their voter base are people living in rural communities. I know that Australia has an image around the world of being a crocodile Dundee country. Maybe not anymore, but actually it's one of the most suburbanized and urbanized countries in the world. So that population is shrinking. It's very small. So their support base is getting smaller and smaller. And I probably would be remiss without finishing by talking a little bit about the rise of the independents in Australia, who are typically what we call teals, combining green interests with blue politics. Blue is the color of the Liberal Party. So they're not interested in redistribution and all those kinds of things, but they really care a lot more about the environment, and they're more socially liberal and those kinds of things. And they've taken an enormous number of inner city seats that were always Liberal seats, always centre-right seats. The richest seats in the country, with the exception of where I live, went to these people. So that's a major change in Australian politics.
No, I think that picture has so many similarities to the British case, and I'm sure a lot of listeners across Europe will recognise a lot of that pattern. It seems like that's almost like the default, the way that a lot of the kind of quote unquote Western kind of political systems seem to be fracturing at the moment. Tom, what about New Zealand? Is it which I should stop the pattern of always like asking Shahar Australia and then New Zealand after, because that's we should upend that hierarchy, which might be perceived. And I'll come to you first on the next question, but given I've already asked Shahar this question, can't undo that. Even with editing, it would be just a bit weird. So New Zealand, is it that same sort of familiar picture that listeners might have, or is it a little bit different?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think New Zealanders know our place in the hierarchy, so there's nothing new about us being second behind Australia. But in terms of the political cultures and sort of traditions, yes, they are very much similar to what Shahar was talking about and to what your listeners will know around the Western world. We have the Labor Party, which has some support from Labor, but not that much. Increasingly relies much more on the PMC and the sort of the actual people who are actually poor and rely on the state for welfare. We've got the National Party, which is a mixture of business, especially big business, the petty bourgeoisie, and also farmers. Because New Zealand basically is a massive farm, so the farmers are quite a big voting constituency, much more so, or a bit more so than in Australia, I think. Got the Green Party as well, which is again very similar social makeup to what Shahar was describing in Australia, but actually a much more politically consequential party in New Zealand than in Australia because of this MMP voting system that I talked about earlier. The Greens have been in coalition governments with Labor in at least two, if not three previous governments over the past 20 years or so. So they've actually, they've had Greens ministers and Greens MPs in the cabinet room, and actually being, it's normal that when Labor wins an election, they usually have the coalition party, and that's the Greens. Whereas in Australia, the Greens and Labor just absolutely hate each other and can't stand the sight of each other. So that's a bit of a different thing, but essentially they represent similar type of constituencies. I guess the one big difference, one big unique thing about New Zealand is the quite prominent role for the indigenous population in New Zealand, the Maori population, which has been a political actor in New Zealand since the beginning, since settlement, 1840. was when New Zealand was officially settled by the British through the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi between the British Crown and a number of Maori tribes. And unlike most of the treaties signed by the British and colonizers elsewhere, this treaty actually held, and it's still around to today, and it granted the Maori equal citizen status to the settlers. They were citizens of the Crown. And very quickly after that, in 1860s, New Zealand actually reserved 4 parliamentary seats for Maori electorates, on which Maori could vote on and elect Maori MPs. So we had Maori MPs in Parliament in the 19th century, which is something that took Australia about 100 years to catch up to. So the Indigenous population has been a much more active participant in the political process since the very beginning. Those Maori seats expanded to 7 seats by the 1990s. They've mostly been held by the Labour Party, which has a very strong link to the Labour, to the Maori community, partially because Maori also were often very working class. They were the labourers that moved from the regional areas, from rural areas to the cities during industrialisation, partially through its connections with Maori churches. There was a very strong link between the Maori communities and the Labour Party, until the 2000s, where a number of sort of disagreements between some of the Maori MPs in Labour led to them to split off and found the Maori Party, which is essentially officially an Indigenous party in New Zealand, and that them and Labour sort of alternate between each other, between holding these Maori seats, the 7 Maori seats, and being a political actor. And the Maori Party, and I guess probably the Maori community more broadly, is a sort of a mixture of social and economic conservatism. So it's much
Right.
It's sort of not the PMC type, although increasingly sort of in the last few years, the Maori Party has sort of started going down the sort of critical race theory, decolonial sort of route, talking about decolonizing New Zealand and so on. But overall, the Maori community, the Maori Party is more on the conservative side, has been on the conservative side, both socially, but also economically, so much more pro-state intervention, less liberal, and so on. And then, like in Australia, which Shahar didn't mention too much because I guess we're starting to get to our topic. There's a ragtag of populists and sort of right-wing nut jobs. Most of them don't really matter in either country. They're sort of, we have our own Trump in Australia, and he's a bit of a joke, really. He couldn't win against the legalized cannabis party, for example, in the last election. So,
Right.
the sort of the right-wing ragtag populists are not really a feature of either country's political system. In New Zealand, that sort of the most prominent party was the New Zealand First Party, which is sort of basically a one-man vanity project by a Maori politician called Winston Peters, who's strongly anti-immigration and strongly anti-Maori being on government welfare, which is an interesting mix. And he's sort of been in coalition with both the Labour and the National Party over various points. He's actually the foreign minister in Jacinda Ardern's first government, which gives you sort of idea of, he's sort of a chameleon that can fit in wherever he gets the baubles of office, as he once called it. But there isn't sort of an insurgent populist movement in either country that we have seen, and that's when we're starting to talk about the differences between how the Antipodes has experienced the end of history and the rest of the West.
Yeah, I mean, I guess coming on to this is the main thing that we really wanted to talk about. Is I think the way that the two of you sort of put it was that New Zealand and Australia seem immune to the end of history dynamics, and at the risk of repeating myself or repeating the book, but on the other hand, the way to become famous is to repeat yourself loudly and often. This idea of the end of history is that this period 1989 to 2016, this was the end of history. Like, all these political questions seemed settled. It was all third way, like Blairism or the regional variants of this, and politics was kind of quite predictable, perhaps, or it seemed to be for particularly the Liberal establishment. And then 2016, essentially Brexit and Trump kind of destroyed this illusion, or ended this period, or certainly kind of capped off the populist decade, and moved us to a new period now where all of those kind of technocratic approaches which had dominated in the end of history suddenly didn't really seem to be quite so world historically universal. So that's the kind of end of history dynamics that we talk about in the book, and obviously listeners may have heard us talk about on the podcast quite a bit as well. So yeah, Tom, I did say I'd come to you first, upend that hierarchy. But yeah, I mean, could you maybe give us a bit, what have I characterized this accurately? Is that the right word to use? That New Zealand and Australia seem immune to these dynamics. What's your kind of starting point, I guess, in tackling this?
Yeah, I think, and this is the reason we wanted to come on the podcast we're still trying to figure this out. And I think, I think we mentioned this at the start. We don't have a book or an article or anything written. We are grappling with this to try to make sense of it. But our sense is that the party's never finished. The end of the history party is still going on in Australia and New Zealand. And the sort of the morbid symptoms, if you wish, to use that phrase, that are visible elsewhere around the global north, especially, but not just the global north, and just haven't happened in Australia and New Zealand. So the two main parties are still as stable and as maybe not as popular as ever, but still as much in charge as ever. They still rotate through, in and out of office, both in Australia and New Zealand. We just had a change of government in Australia last year after 9 years of the Liberal Party being in power. Now Labor's back in after 9 years out of power. In New Zealand, National and Labour have continued alternating in and out of power. Jacinda Ardern even won the very first majority government in the history of the MMP system since 1996. We haven't, as I mentioned, we haven't seen any populist sort of massive challenges emerge from anywhere. And Shahar can talk about this as well, but the politics of both parties is still essentially quite centrist and quite technocratic. A little bit less so in the last few years of the Liberal Party government in Australia, because, essentially they were just clowned by the end of it. But, in New Zealand, we had, almost 9 years in power of John Key, who was a former investment banker, and he ran a sort of a centre-right, very sensible, very technocratic government. The biggest flourish that he had was talking about changing the New Zealand flag to remove the Union Jack from it. And the referendum on that failed miserably, because people were just like, what's the point? So, this was around 2017, I think 2018. And you could easily see how that would become a culture war sort of issue if that was the environment for it, but it never really, it just fizzled into nothing. The Labour parties that have been in power in both countries in the last in the last few years in New Zealand and last year in Australia are essentially just replaying the third way hits. Essentially the sort of the storybook that you'll be familiar with from the New Labour years in the UK, and the New Democrats in the US, the Social Democrats in Germany under Chodor and so on. We're still doing all these things. In fact, we believe them more than any other Labour Party in the world, it seems, or those more than any other two Labour parties in the world, I should say. Shahar can maybe talk a little bit about some of the sort of policy agendas that they've adopted in areas like housing, or trying to finance various projects.
But the overall picture then, just to kind of summarize, is political stability, major party domination, no real populist moment, centrism still reigns, technocracy is still the order of the day. Is that, Shahar, is that about fair summary as a starting point?
Oh, absolutely. When the Labor Party returned to power in Australia after being in opposition for 9 years, firstly, they came back to power in a very small target strategy, as people call it, meaning that they, didn't set out to make any big announcements so that they could not be pinned down for anything in particular. And then now they're coming back with a raft of ideas for how to address some of the country's growing issues. One of them is housing. We can get back to that later. It's become really expensive, unaffordable. Rental properties are very hard to get. So how do they wish to address that issue? They're trying to crowd in, as we say, private investors into a housing fund that they created. Very few big ticket items, very few attempts to really rock the fiscal boat. They already came across as more fiscally conservative than the party that was in power before them, on the right. They're now saying, look, these are difficult times economically. We need to make sure that we don't live beyond our means. So, this is hardly, we've all seen this. We've heard it before. But that's the kind of stuff that they're running. Now, alongside that, and again, this is nothing unusual, they have a range of what you may call sort of like soft left, what some people might call woke type policies that they're pushing as well. The big one, which is going to go to referendum this year, is the one of the voice for the Indigenous population of Australia. Now, some people might be crossed if they heard me put it in those terms. Maybe some people feel more strongly about that, but I don't think the wider Australian public feels particularly strongly about this issue. But it's one of those kind of inclusion and diversity type issues that the party is interested in promoting. And that's how they advance their kind of progressive credentials, while at the same time on the economic side doing the same old thing.
So yeah, I guess the question then, if that's the picture, what explains this? Is it as simple as there's an electoral system that we've already talked about, particularly in Australia, that makes it easy for the big parties to win government, and that's just that force of status has been sufficient to prevent the end of history, to inoculate the Antipodes against it? Or is that a bit too simple?
I think that that's the simplest explanation that you'll get, and lots of people will tell you that's the reason in Australia. And certainly I've heard a lot of people in other countries say that they should adopt similar things to what Australia has, meaning compulsory voting and preferential voting, which I mentioned before, because that breeds stability. So when you don't have to bring out the vote, the argument is that you don't need to appeal to the base. You can appeal to the centre. I'm just going to rehash those kinds of arguments because people have said it a lot in Australia, maybe in other parts of the world, not so much. So you don't have to bring out the vote. Preferential voting means that it's likely that one of the candidates of the bigger party is going to be elected in every electorate. It's a lot easier for them to do that. And consequently, you just get that stability. And indeed, it's not entirely wrong, because the Labor government was elected with an absolute majority last year, but with only 30% of the vote. So it's not entirely wrong that has a role to play in stabilizing politics around the two major parties. And Tom can explain a little bit about why New Zealand shows that that's not really the case, so that it's not. In New Zealand, you get similar outcomes with a very different system. But I don't think that's a good enough argument, even in the Australian case alone. And I think there are a number of reasons for that. Firstly, we mentioned before the lack of success of Australia's populists. Tom mentioned Australia's Trump, and it makes me laugh even to think about him in those terms. But he did really try to pass himself off as this billionaire called Clive Palmer. He comes from my hometown of Brisbane, larger than life, and he had a series of campaigns and ads, both on the internet and on the streets. They basically kind of try to use that slogan of "Make Australia Great." I don't think he said again. Maybe doesn't think it was ever great, but maybe he wants to make it great now. And he really took on a lot of that Trumpian language, try to get people riled up. He also tried to get people to vote for him because he thought there was a groundswell of anger around the COVID restrictions. And so he tried to kind of get people motivated around that. Because he's a billionaire, he spent more money than all of the other parties combined. So he has a bit of that, in similarity with Trump. But as Tom mentioned, he got fewer votes than the legalized cannabis party, which didn't spend quite that much money.
No.
And none of the other right-wing populists...
Not on the campaign, at least.
Yeah, well, that's true. And none of the right-wing populists actually did particularly well. In fact, there is an argument to say that the Liberal and National shift to the right has actually been one of the main reasons they lost. They were seeing as a little bit too far to the right for most Australians. Currently, they hold only one state government, and that's Tasmania, which is the smallest state in Australia. And even the state government in Tasmania is trying to distance itself as much as possible from the federal party. They're trying to not be seen to have anything to do with them, lest people associate them with the people in the National Party. And even those people within the federal wing of the Liberal Party, by the standards of the kind of people you get in the in the Republican Party in the United States, they are very tame. I'm telling you now. There's very few loose cannons among the ranks there. And second, even though the major parties did lose a share of their vote, they lost most of their votes actually to people like the Teals, who are, if you want to call them populists, the most you'd get is techno-populists, but they're not even that. They're actually just people who want to talk about how politics should be cleaner and about how they're like the epitome of centrism. And all of them came from the safest seats in Australia. All of the efforts that people have attempted here to import US-style culture wars have actually done very poorly. And just to give one example, there was a candidate in the seat of Warringah, which is in Sydney. It's actually also one of Australia's most affluent seats. But it used to vote for the Liberal Party. And she tried to campaign on basically like on a culture war issue, which is trans rights. And that backfired very badly. She actually, even though the seat wasn't the Liberal Party's before, they lost them already in the previous election to an independent, a teal independent, as they call them. There was an even bigger swing against them this time, and a lot of people attributed to that kind of politics, this attempt to bring in that kind of culture war issue into the political domain. It just doesn't work here.
Hello, Alex here. That's the end of part 1. If you like what you've heard, remember to rate and review this podcast and join us at patreon.com/bungacast for Lenin, lamb meat, liberalism, and lithium. See you there.